All right, so get this. We're diving into Trump's second inauguration
Second inauguration.
as the 47th president of the United States.
Wow.
Second non-consecutive term.
That's right.
Talk about unusual.
Huh.
You sent over a real mix of sources, news articles, Wikipedia, even some chatter from social media.
Yeah, it seems like
Everyone's got an opinion on this one.
absolutely. It's definitely a historic moment.
Yeah.
And all of the sources that you've provided really capture just how many layers there are to this event.
Yeah, it's not every day we see an inauguration happening inside, right?
Right.
Last time that happened was Reagan's second term back in '85.
Mm.
But this time it's the Capitol Rotunda
Mm.
because D.C. is expecting some seriously frigid temperatures and high winds. And to add another layer of complexity,
Right.
it's all going down on Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
That's right. It's only the second time an inauguration has fallen on MLK Day.
Oh, wow.
The first was Bill Clinton's back in 1997.
Okay.
So right off the bat, we've got a lot of historical and symbolic weight to unpack.
Okay, so we've got this unusual setting, a date loaded with meaning and a whole lot of buzz. Where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, let's start with the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Okay.
The Joint Congressional Committee has been handling all the preparations
Got
since
it.
May 2024.
Wow.
Senator Amy Klobuchar even got to kick things off by hammering in the ceremonial first nail for the inauguration platform back in September.
Really?
It seems they've been thinking ahead.
Talk about planning. But I've also seen reports about some potential protests,
Yeah.
which makes me think about the January 6th attack and even the massive Women's March back in 2017. Things feel a bit tense, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Security is definitely a major concern this time around.
Yeah.
There are reports that the Capitol Police are bracing for potential unrest from various groups, some with a history of large-scale demonstrations.
Oh.
And organizers of the 2017 Women's March are reportedly planning a similar demonstration, calling it the People's March.
Oh.
It appears they're leaving no stone unturned when it comes to security measures.
Yeah.
With the National Guard and multiple law enforcement agencies involved.
So we've got this backdrop of heightened security and the echoes of past events. But amidst all of this, another thing that jumped out at me was the funding the Trump-Vance Inaugural Committee,
Right?
led by Steve Witkoff. And Kelly Loeffler has apparently raised a record-breaking amount, over $170 million.
Yeah.
With some sources saying it could reach $200 million.
That's an eye-popping figure. It really underscores the financial muscle behind this inauguration.
And here's where I think things get really interesting. A significant chunk of those donations are coming from some of the biggest names in tech.
Okay.
OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, even Amazon's Jeff Bezos, who was reportedly offered to stream the ceremony on Amazon Prime.
Wow.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does.
Is this a sign of a changing dynamic between Silicon Valley and the incoming administration?
Yeah, you know.
After all, there was a fair amount of tension between these tech figures and Trump during his first term.
That's a very astute observation.
Good.
We have to consider whether these hefty donations signal a desire to forge a closer relationship with the new administration.
Right.
Perhaps to influence policy or simply smooth over past disagreements.
Right.
Remember, these tech giants wield considerable influence, and their support could be a valuable asset for Trump as he embarks on a second term.
It's almost like we're seeing two worlds collide.
Right.
The populist energy of Trump's base and the financial clout of these tech titans.
Yeah.
It's a mix that I don't think we've seen before in an inauguration.
You're right. It's an unusual juxtaposition.
Yeah.
And it raises questions about how Trump will navigate these competing interests.
Right.
Will he prioritize the concerns of his base, or will he cater to the needs of his powerful allies?
Okay, so we've covered the security concerns and the money trail, but let's move on to something that always generates a lot of buzz.
Mm-hmm.
The guest list. We've got the expected attendees, former Presidents Obama, Bush, and Clinton, along with former First Ladies Hillary Clinton and Laura Bush. However, one notable absence is Michelle Obama.
Okay.
But it's the international guests that have really caught my eye.
Interesting.
We're talking about a very diverse and, dare I say, intriguing mix of leaders.
It's certainly an eclectic group. For the first time ever, a senior Chinese official will be attending a U.S. presidential inauguration.
Wow.
Vice President Han Zheng.
Wow.
We also have Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Argentina's new president Javier Milei, and Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban.
It's a global who's who.
It is.
And let's not forget, former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss and leaders from the QA nations, India, Australia, and Japan.
Right.
Plus, there's a contingent of European politicians who are considered to be on the far right.
Yeah.
Figures like Eric Zemmour and Mary Maréchal from France.
Right.
I'm curious, what do you make of this unusual mix of international attendees?
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it? You've got traditional allies like the QA8 nations, alongside figures who have been openly critical of the U.S. in the past.
Right.
And the presence of far-right European politicians is sure to raise eyebrows.
Yeah.
It's almost as if Trump is sending a signal about his foreign policy priorities, or perhaps a lack thereof.
It makes you wonder what kind of message he's trying to send both domestically and internationally.
Indeed, this unusual guest list certainly adds another layer of intrigue to an already fascinating event.
You know, before we move on to the actual Inauguration Day events, there's one more thing I want to touch upon.
Okay.
It's something that really struck me as a departure from the traditional focus on a peaceful transition of power.
Okay.
Trump held a pre-inauguration rally
Yes.
at the Capital One Arena, and over 20,000 supporters showed up.
Wow.
It's not exactly the image of unity and reconciliation that we usually associate with inaugurations.
You're right to point that out. It's a very unconventional move to have this large-scale rally with Elon Musk and Trump's sons in attendance just days before the inauguration. It certainly sends a different message compared to the more traditional focus on a smooth handover of power.
It's like he's choosing to emphasize his connection with his base over the traditional formalities of the transition. It's a bold statement, to say the least.
It certainly is. And it raises questions about how this approach will translate into his governing style in this second term.
So we've got this backdrop of potential protests, an eclectic guest list, a record-breaking amount of funding, and a pre-inauguration rally that feels more like a campaign event.
Right.
It's shaping up to be an inauguration unlike any other.
Absolutely. And I think all of these elements will give us crucial insights into the kind of presidency Trump envisions for his second term.
All right, so let's take a deep breath and dive into the details of Inauguration Day itself. What can we expect to see unfold?
Well, the day will begin with a swearing-in ceremony right there in the Capitol Rotunda.
Okay.
Chief Justice John Roberts will be administering the oath to President Trump, while Justice Brett Kavanaugh, one of Trump's own appointees to the Supreme Court, will swear in Vice President J.D. Vance.
That's a pretty powerful image right there, to have two figures so closely tied to Trump's legacy officiating the oaths. It seems very deliberate.
You're picking up on some key symbolism there.
Yeah.
The choice of these two officials speaks volumes about how Trump wants to frame his second term, emphasizing both continuity and the lasting impact of his judicial appointments.
I also noticed that Carrie Underwood and Lee Greenwood are scheduled to perform.
Oh, okay.
Their musical styles seem to be a very direct appeal to Trump's base.
Yeah.
Even the entertainment choices seem to carry a political message.
It's true, even the seemingly minor details can take on a larger significance in this context.
Right.
And speaking of details, I'm curious about those unofficial inaugural balls that are happening before and after the main event.
Oh, yeah?
Those have always been a fascinating window into the various power dynamics at play.
I completely agree. Those unofficial balls not organized by the inaugural committee give us a glimpse into those behind-the-scenes alliances and the interests vying for influence. It's like a parallel celebration running alongside the official events.
Exactly. It's a reminder that while the inauguration ceremony itself is a carefully choreographed affair, there's a whole other layer of maneuvering and deal-making happening behind the scenes, and that's where things can get really interesting. It's fascinating how these unofficial gatherings reflect the broader political landscape, wouldn't you say?
It's absolutely. It's like you've got this carefully staged inauguration ceremony on one hand with all its pomp and circumstance, and then you have these more informal events happening around it.
Right.
Where you get a glimpse of the real power dynamics at play.
Precisely. It's a reminder that power isn't just about formal titles or positions, it's also about influence connections and the ability to shape the agenda behind the scenes.
And speaking of shaping the agenda, I'm really curious to dive into the potential policy implications of Trump's second term.
Okay.
We've talked about this clash between populism and power, between his base and those powerful allies he seems to be courting.
Right.
How do you see that tension playing out in terms of actual policy?
Well, based on what we've seen from Trump's pre-inauguration statements and the makeup of his incoming administration, I think we can expect some pretty significant shifts in a number of key areas.
Okay.
Immigration is almost certainly going to be a major focus.
Okay.
He's repeatedly talked about implementing stricter border controls and taking a hard line on undocumented immigration.
That definitely aligns with what we heard during his campaigns and rallies.
Right.
The build the wall chants haven't exactly faded from memory.
Yeah.
And with some of his more hardline appointees, it seems like he's signaling a pretty tough stance.
You're right. And we can't forget that the composition of the Supreme Court has changed since his first term.
Oh, that's true.
With several of his own appointees on the bench, any legal challenges to his immigration policies could play out quite differently this time around.
That's a really important point. The court's ideological leanings could have a huge impact on whether his agenda succeeds or not. It's not just about the policies themselves, it's about the legal and judicial landscape in which they're being implemented.
Exactly. It's a complex interplay of different forces.
Right.
But moving beyond immigration, I think we can also anticipate some major changes in energy policy.
Sure.
Trump has always been a vocal supporter of the fossil fuel industry, and he's already hinted at wanting to ramp up domestic oil and gas production.
That seems to go hand in hand with his America First rhetoric.
Right.
It's about prioritizing energy independence,
Wow.
even if it means potentially rolling back some of the environmental regulations that have been put in place in recent years.
You hit the nail on the head, and that's bound to create friction with environmental groups and even some members of the international community who have been pushing for more aggressive action on climate change.
It's almost inevitable that there will be pushback both domestically and internationally.
Yeah.
Trump has never been one to shy away from confrontation, especially when it comes to issues like climate change and global trade.
Speaking of trade,
Yeah.
that's another area where we should brace ourselves for some potential shakeups.
Okay.
Remember the trade wars that erupted during his first term?
Oh, yeah.
Those tariffs and trade disputes had a pretty significant impact on the global economy.
Oh, I remember those. They created a lot of uncertainty and volatility in the markets.
Yeah?
And it seems like he might be ready for round two.
Uh-huh.
He's already talked about wanting to renegotiate trade deals and take a more protectionist stance.
Exactly. And that could lead to renewed tensions with China, the European Union, and even some of America's traditional trading partners.
Wow.
It's a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, he wants to protect American jobs and industries.
Right.
But on the other hand, too much protectionism could backfire and harm the economy in the long run.
It's a high-stakes game for sure.
It is.
And it's not just about economics.
Yeah.
These trade disputes can also spill over into the realm of geopolitics, potentially affecting alliances and even security arrangements.
Absolutely. Trade is never just about trade. It's intertwined with all these other factors, national security, diplomacy, even cultural perceptions.
Right.
So any major shifts in trade policy under Trump are going to have ripple effects across the globe.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
How something as seemingly straightforward as trade can become this incredibly complex and multifaceted issue.
It really is. And I think that complexity is something we need to keep in mind as we try to understand the broader implications of Trump's second term.
Yeah.
We've got these potential shifts in immigration, energy, and trade, all of them intertwined with domestic politics, international relations, and the global economy.
It's like we're watching this intricate web of interconnected issues all being pulled and pushed in different directions. And at the center of it all is Trump trying to navigate these competing forces and assert his own vision.
That's a great way to put it. It's this incredibly dynamic and unpredictable landscape, and I think it's safe to say that we're all in for a pretty wild ride over the next few years.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the potential for policy shifts in key areas like immigration, energy, and trade.
Yeah.
And we've touched on how those shifts might play out in the context of the current political and economic climate.
Right.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I think we need to examine more closely, the voices of dissent.
You're right. We can't just focus on what Trump and his administration are planning to do. We also need to understand how different groups are responding to his return to power.
Right.
And that means taking a closer look at the Democratic boycott and those planned people's marches.
Exactly. Let's dive into that. We left off talking about the voices rising in opposition to Trump's second term. The Democratic boycott is a pretty significant statement, wouldn't you say?
It is. It's definitely more than just a symbolic gesture. This boycott goes beyond typical partisan disagreements. For many, the fact that the inauguration falls on Martin Luther King Jr. Day adds a whole other layer of complexity. It raises questions about the values being represented and whether this event aligns with the legacy of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. And then there's the undeniable shadow of January 6th.
Right.
That attack on the Capitol, fueled by Trump's own rhetoric about a stolen election, has left a deep wound on American democracy. It's hard to imagine that event not weighing heavily on people's minds as Trump returns to power.
You're absolutely right. The boycott can be seen as a refusal to normalize or legitimize what many view as an attack on democratic norms. It's a way of saying, we're not going to pretend that everything is okay. We're not going to simply move on.
It speaks to a really profound sense of unease
It does.
about the state of American democracy. This isn't just about policy differences anymore. It's about fundamental values and anxieties about the future.
And those anxieties are also fueling the people's marches that are planned across the country this weekend.
Yeah.
These demonstrations, organized by a coalition of different activist groups, represent a more direct form of dissent.
I've seen reports that these marches are expected to draw huge crowds, with people coming together to express a whole range of concerns, everything from Trump's stance on immigration and climate change to his rhetoric on race and gender. It seems like this inauguration is serving as a real focal point for both celebration and resistance.
It's a moment that's laying bare the deep divisions within American society.
Yeah.
And those divisions aren't confined to our borders. They also have implications for America's role in the world.
That's a crucial point. We talked earlier about that eclectic mix of international figures attending the inauguration.
Right.
But what does Trump's return really mean for global alliances, trade relationships, and the overall balance of power?
It's the question that everyone is asking, and there are no easy answers. Trump's America First approach, his skepticism of international institutions, and his willingness to upend the status quo have created a lot of uncertainty on the global stage.
Yeah, his first term was marked by trade wars, diplomatic clashes, and a withdrawal from some key international agreements. Some might argue that he brought a much-needed dose of disruption to the global order, shaking things up and challenging the established powers.
That's one way to look at it. Others might say that his actions were reckless and destabilizing, that they weakened alliances and emboldened authoritarian leaders.
So the big question is, which approach will he take in his second term?
Right.
Will he double down on those disruptive policies or try to adopt a more pragmatic approach?
It's hard to say for sure, but his actions will be closely scrutinized by world leaders. His relationships with figures like Xi Jinping of China, Vladimir Putin of Russia, and even traditional allies in Europe will be under a microscope.
It feels like we're entering a period of real uncertainty and flux, both domestically and internationally.
We are.
The stakes are incredibly high.
You've summed it up perfectly. This isn't just a ceremonial event. It's a pivotal moment in history. And the choices made in the coming months and years, both by Trump and by those who oppose him, will have a lasting impact.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the unusual setting, the symbolism, the potential policy shifts, and the voices of dissent. But I think the biggest takeaway is that this is just the beginning of the story.
Exactly. This inauguration may be over, but the conversation is far from finished. We're going to be grappling with the implications of Trump's return for years to come.
So to our listeners, this is where we hand the baton over to you. We've given you a lot to think about.
We have.
But this is just the starting point now. It's up to you to stay engaged, to critically evaluate the information you encounter, and to participate in a democratic process in whatever way you can.
This is a story that we're all writing together, and it's more important than ever to stay informed, stay curious, and keep asking those tough questions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.